London, 1810. A city of chimneys and carriage wheels, of candlelit parlors where fortunes rose and reputations perished before a single dawn could break. The season had begun in full, its frenzy spilling from the drawing rooms of Mayfair into every corner of polite society, and for Lady Evelina Harcourt, it was meant to be the season that secured her future at last. She stepped from her family's modest carriage with a quiet breath, smoothing the pale blue silk of her gown as if it might steady the rhythm of her heart. Tonight, at the Montfort Estate's famed spring soirée, her engagement to Sir Rowland Kerr was expected to be formally declared. It was a moment she had been raised to anticipate, the triumph of duty, beauty, and careful restraint. Yet beneath her poised exterior lay a fragile uncertainty she dared not confess to anyone. Sir Rowland awaited her at the entrance, handsome in his polished boots and crisp white cravat. He offered his arm with a smile that was practiced rather than warm, though Evelina was accustomed to mistaking its gleam for affection. The guests surged behind them in a flurry of silk and perfume, filling the grand hall with laughter, harp music, and the restless hum of ambition. Everywhere she looked, Evelina saw faces she had known since childhood, ladies prepared to analyze every whispered word, gentlemen ready to weigh every alliance, matrons eager to compare dowries as though they were entries in a ledger rather than the destinies of young women. Evelina clung to Rowland's arm, hoping his confidence might lend her some of its shine. But even as they entered the ballroom beneath a constellation of chandeliers, she sensed an unusual tension radiating from him. His posture, always carefully erect, had grown stiff with something more troubling than formality. His gaze darted from one cluster of guests to another, as though he feared they observed him with unspoken judgment. Evelina attempted to ease the moment with a tentative smile, yet he seemed not to notice. "Rowland," she murmured, "is something amiss?" He did not answer at first. Instead, he guided her toward the center of the ballroom, where the orchestra was beginning a lively quadrille. His hand tightened over hers until it pinched, and when he finally spoke, it was through a strained whisper. "We shall talk shortly. For now, behave naturally." A ripple of unease passed through Evelina, but she obeyed, lifting her chin with the elegance her governess had trained into her since girlhood. She allowed him to lead her into the dance, her skirts swirling like pale water over the polished floor. The music attempted to buoy her spirits, urging her into the familiar patterns of steps and turns, yet each passing moment sharpened her awareness that something dreadful was coiling in the air between them. Rowland's smile flickered, never reaching his eyes. His replies to her gentle questions grew shorter, stripped of courtesy. As the dance concluded, he released her hand abruptly, as though contact itself had become disagreeable. A few matrons nearby paused in their conversations, observing with predatory interest. Evelina felt her pulse weaken. Rowland's color had risen sharply, and he tugged at his gloves as if they had become intolerably tight. "Rowland," she whispered again, "please." His expression hardened. "Lady Evelina," he said with a tone just loud enough to reach the nearest listeners, "it appears I have been grievously misled." A hush fell between them like a sudden frost. A pair of young women turned toward them at once. A gentleman stilled mid-step, pretending to admire a painting so he could hear better. Evelina forced herself to inhale. "Misled?" she repeated softly, praying he would lower his voice. He did not. "I have learned," he declared, "that the dowry which I was assured accompanied our arrangement is but a fraction of what your family allowed society to believe." Heat flamed in Evelina's cheeks as though she had been struck. "Rowland, this conversation is not for—" "It is precisely for this audience," he interrupted coldly. "For I will not have my name attached to whispers of deception." A few gasps flickered around them. A lady dropped her fan. A gentleman choked on a mouthful of champagne. Evelina felt the walls tilt, the chandeliers blur into trembling halos of light. She tried to speak, to explain that her family had never made false claims, only remained silent as their finances quietly declined, but Rowland raised his voice further, drowning her attempt at dignity. "I cannot," he announced, "bind myself to a future built upon misrepresentation. Therefore our engagement, formal or otherwise, is dissolved as of this moment." The orchestra, mid-melody, faltered. A violin screeched. The music fell apart like paper soaked through. Evelina stood alone, the room spinning while dozens of eyes pierced her. She reached instinctively for Rowland's retreating figure, but he was already striding toward a cluster of gentlemen eager for the next scandal. For a moment, she could neither breathe nor blink. Shame swept through her with such force she feared her knees might give way. She felt every whisper like a physical blow, every sneer like a stain spreading across her carefully preserved composure. She could not remain in the ballroom another second. Gathering what remained of her dignity, she turned and left, the rustle of her skirts drowned by the rising tide of gossip. The night air struck her as she emerged onto the terrace, crisp with the scent of damp stone and distant rain. She gripped the balustrade, willing herself not to cry. Tears, she knew, were ammunition in the hands of society. But the humiliation overwhelmed her defenses, and a single tear escaped, trailing hotly down her cheek. Within minutes, her family found her, her mother breathless with worry, her father leaning heavily on his cane. Their eyes told her all she needed to know. The scandal would spread by morning, swift and unforgiving. Invitations would vanish, friends would retreat, and her family's fragile standing would crumble further under the weight of public disgrace. The carriage ride home passed in suffocating silence. Evelina gazed out the window, watching lamplight smudge the darkness in wavering blurs. Her mother attempted reassurance, but her trembling voice betrayed her fear. Her father's hand rested over hers in quiet apology, though he said nothing. Evelina sensed their desperation, their helplessness, and it knotted painfully in her chest. At dawn, the scandal appeared in the gossip columns with cruel precision. Lady E. Harcourt publicly discarded. Finance to blame? Every line stung with the sharpness of half-truths. Every insinuation burrowed deeper into the wound Roland had opened. Evelina read none of it directly. Her mother tried to hide the newspaper, but she felt its presence in the way servants moved quietly, in the absence of callers, in the pitying looks exchanged across breakfast. 3 days passed before the letter arrived. A footman, pale and uncertain, presented an envelope sealed with a crest none of them immediately recognized, a phoenix crowned by 2 laurel branches. Her father's brows drew together in surprise. He broke the seal with slow, arthritic fingers and read the letter once, then again, before passing it to Evelina with a look of disbelief. The Duke of Ashberry, an elusive figure whispered about in society. A war hero left wounded and reclusive after the Napoleonic campaigns, offered a proposal of marriage. It was formal, without sentiment, written in impeccable handwriting that revealed nothing of the man behind the signature. He sought an alliance beneficial to both families, acknowledging the Harcourt's compromised position with surprising tact. Evelina stared at the letter, reading every line twice. She had never met the Duke, had scarcely heard more than rumors of a nobleman who seldom left his estate and was said to rely upon a wheelchair. Yet the offer was undeniably serious, and, more importantly, it offered a reprieve from the ruin Roland had inflicted. She looked to her parents, whose expressions reflected the weight of the decision. Her mother's hands trembled, her father's voice cracked as he urged her to consider the security such a match would bring. Evelina understood their fear. She understood her own. But she also understood what awaited her if she refused. With quiet resolve, Evelina took up the pen. Her hand did not feel like her own as she signed her acceptance at the bottom of the page, the ink blooming dark and irrevocable across the parchment. She set the pen aside, an odd stillness settling over her as the reality of the moment sank in. She had stepped from one humiliation into the uncertain shadow of another life entirely. And though she could not yet fathom what awaited her at Ashberry Hall, something in her chest whispered that the path unfolding before her, however daunting, would not leave her unchanged. For better or worse, her fate had shifted, and the world would soon discover that shame, when endured with dignity, could become the first spark of a far greater story. The road to Ashberry Hall wound through miles of quiet countryside, its hedgerows blooming with early spring buds that swayed like pale lanterns in the breeze. Evelina watched them pass from the carriage window, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The city's clamor faded behind her with each turn of the wheels, replaced by the solemn peace of open fields and distant hills. Yet her thoughts were anything but peaceful. She was traveling not toward a husband she knew, but toward a life she could only imagine in fragments, shaped by whispers and half-truths. When the carriage finally approached the estate, Evelina felt her breath still in her throat. Ashberry Hall rose from the mist like something born of another century, a vast stone manor with high mullioned windows and ivy clinging to its aged facade. It had the air of a home that had weathered both triumph and tragedy, standing dignified despite the shadows of its past. As they halted before the entrance, the great oak doors opened, and a small procession of servants emerged with solemn precision. At their head was the Duke's steward, Mr. Havering, a lean man with silvered hair and a voice imbued with quiet authority. "Lady Evelina," he greeted her with a respectful bow, "His Grace awaits you in the west parlor." Evelina stepped out, her shoes meeting the stone courtyard with a hesitant tap. Though her heart fluttered anxiously, she maintained the graceful composure expected of a bride entering her new home. The steward led her through the vast corridors, where tapestries and ancestral portraits watched her passage with silent scrutiny. She caught glimpses of polished floors, tall windows drenched in soft afternoon light, and a lingering stillness that seemed to envelop every chamber. When they reached the west parlor, Mr. Havering paused, offered a gentle nod, and opened the door. Evelina entered alone. The Duke of Ashberry sat by the fireplace, his figure framed by the glow of flames that cast amber highlights across his dark hair. He looked up as she approached, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds, steady, observant, and unexpectedly kind. He wore a formal coat, though the blanket covering his lower frame discreetly acknowledged the reason he remained seated. "Lady Evelina," he said, inclining his head. His voice was deep and composed, marked by an unmistakable refinement. "Welcome to Ashberry." She curtsied with practiced grace. "Your Grace, thank you for receiving me." He studied her for a moment, not with the cold appraisal she had grown used to from Roland and his circle, but with a measured curiosity that suggested he sought to understand her rather than judge her. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly, as though her presence eased something weighted inside him. "I regret," he began, "that circumstances compelled haste in our arrangements. I would have preferred to court you properly, yet propriety allowed neither of us such leisure." Evelina lowered her eyes. "You speak generously, Your Grace. I understand necessity as well as you." A faint smile touched his lips, though it did not fully reach his eyes. "Necessity, yes. But I hope necessity alone does not define what follows." He gestured toward a nearby chair. She took it, folding her hands neatly over her skirts, waiting for him to lead the conversation. Instead, he regarded her with a thoughtful quiet. "You must wonder," he said at last, "why I sought this union. I assure you, it was not pity." His frankness struck her with unexpected relief. "I had wondered," she admitted softly. "My injuries," he continued, "have made me an object of speculation. Invitations ceased long before I chose seclusion. Those who once praised me learned to avert their eyes. I have grown accustomed to whispers, but not indifferent to companionship. A household requires a mistress, and a future requires hope." The candor of his confession surprised her. It was not the declaration of a lovelorn man, but the honest acknowledgment of one who had lost more than he cared to display. "I appreciate your honesty," she replied, "and I do not approach this marriage seeking rescue, only a chance to begin anew." The Duke's gaze warmed, and for a fleeting instant, Evelina sensed the gentleness that lay beneath his composed exterior. Yet he did not press sentiment. Instead, he signaled the end of their private conversation with quiet dignity. "You will find Ashberry Hall yours to command," he said. "Your chambers are prepared, and should you need anything, Mr. Havering will attend to it. I prefer not to impose upon you. Therefore, we need not dine together unless you wish it." His generosity startled her. After Roland's suffocating expectations, the Duke's restraint felt almost unreal. "I would be glad," she said, "to share dinner on occasion, Your Grace." He inclined his head. "As you wish." In the days that followed, Evelina began to learn the rhythms of her new home. Ashberry Hall, though grand, did not thrum with the vanity or excess of London. Servants moved with a quiet diligence, responding to the Duke's expectations of fairness rather than fear. Evelina found solace in the conservatory, where sunlight filtered through glass panes to warm the budding orchids and roses. She began sketching again, something she had nearly abandoned during her engagement to Roland, who found such pursuits trivial. One morning, she discovered a package waiting on the table by her bedroom door. Inside lay a beautifully bound botanical journal, its pages thick and inviting, accompanied by a small note written in the Duke's careful script, "For your hours of quiet reflection." Evelina traced the inked letters with her fingertips, feeling something within her chest loosen. It was not a grand gesture, but it carried sincerity, something far rarer. When she thanked him later that evening, he only nodded as though the matter were inconsequential. Yet she noticed the subtle shift in his expression, as if her gratitude mattered more than he wished to reveal. But outside the manor's stone walls, the world had not forgotten her scandal. Letters arrived from London, some unsigned, others cruelly direct, reminding her of Roland's betrayal. She burned most without reading them fully, though the sting of each lingered like the aftertaste of something bitter. Once, she caught the Duke observing her as she discarded a letter into the fire. His brows tightened, not in judgment, but in a restrained mix of concern and anger. He said nothing, but she sensed his desire to shield her from such pettiness. As the days lengthened into weeks, Evelina began to observe the Duke more closely. He carried himself with unwavering composure, yet there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when pain flickered across his features. Sometimes she heard muted thuds from the east wing, as though something heavy had fallen. The servants dismissed it as repairs, but Evelina felt an inexplicable pull toward the truth. Her curiosity, however, was tempered by respect for his privacy. One evening, while reading before the fire, she glimpsed the Duke leaving the room with a stiffness more pronounced than usual. Mr. Havering hovered a moment longer than needed, watching him with quiet worry. Something was happening within these walls, something the Duke concealed beneath layers of discipline and pride. Evelina did not yet know its nature, but she sensed it would reach her soon, and change everything. A storm gathered over Ashberry Hall with the slow inevitability of a breath drawn too deeply, clouds thickening until the sky darkened into a brooding slate. Evelina sensed the change long before the first rumble of thunder. The atmosphere within the manor shifted as though the walls themselves tightened against some secret strain. Servants moved briskly, shutters were secured, and lamps were lit early, their amber glow casting restless shadows down the corridors. Evelina, restless from a day spent battling intrusive memories of London's cruelty, found herself pacing the length of her chambers, unable to quiet the tension coiling in her chest. As the storm broke at last, rain lashed the windows with unrestrained ferocity, each gust rattling the panes as if urging the house to surrender. Evelina, drawn by an unexplainable impulse, stepped into the corridor, her candle flickering as she walked. The manor was unusually silent. Even the portraits seemed to watch her more intently, their painted eyes glinting in the shifting light. She had taken no more than a dozen steps before she heard it, a muffled thud, followed by a strained exhalation, distant but unmistakable. The sound came from the east wing, the part of the manor she had been told was under repair, though she had seen no craftsmen nor tools. She hesitated, torn between curiosity and propriety. Yet the noise came again, sharper this time, like wood striking stone. Her candle shook in her grasp as she turned toward the forbidden corridor, its walls narrower, the air cooler, carrying the faint scent of oil and metal. She advanced slowly, each step guided by growing concern rather than impulse. Another sound, this one a low groan, sealed her decision. Someone was in pain. At the end of the hall stood a door she had not noticed before, its dark surface unmarred by dust. Light seeped beneath it in a thin, wavering line. Evelina raised her hand, knocked once, and waited. No answer. She knocked again, firmer, yet silence followed. Driven by fear that outweighed manners, she pushed the door open. The sight inside stole the air from her lungs. The Duke stood between two parallel bars fixed to the floor, his arms trembling as they bore the weight of his body. Sweat darkened his shirt, clinging to his back and shoulders, and his breath came in ragged gasps. His legs, braced with leather straps and metal supports, quivered violently beneath him. For a fleeting moment, one both heroic and heartbreaking, he remained upright, suspended between determination and agony. Then, with a strangled sound, his strength gave way. Evelina gasped as he collapsed, catching himself against the bars before sinking heavily into the waiting wheelchair behind him. Her candle nearly slipped from her hand. "Your Grace." He jerked his head toward her, shock and humiliation flashing through his eyes. "Evelina," he said, his voice hoarse, "you should not be here." She stepped inside without asking permission, closing the door behind her to shield him from any wandering witness. Rain hammered the windows, wind howling like some wild creature. The Duke avoided her gaze, focusing on adjusting the brace that had slipped down his left leg. His hands shook. "I heard something," she said softly. "I feared you were injured." His jaw tightened. "I am accustomed to injury. It need not trouble you." "But it does trouble me," she insisted, moving closer until the sharp scent of metal and sweat mingled with the faint fragrance of her lavender dress. "You have been hurting alone." He closed his eyes briefly, the muscles in his throat working as though he fought some inward battle. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of its usual composure. "This is not something I intended you to witness." Evelina crouched beside him, her skirts pooling around her like a halo of pale silk. "Then help me understand." A storm raged outside, another lingered within him. He exhaled slowly, the breath shaking as though releasing years of guarded silence. "After the campaign," he began, "the physicians told me I would never stand again. My spine was damaged beyond repair. I believed them at first. What choice had I? But despair is a cruel companion. It whispers defeat until one forgets how to defy it. I refused to allow it that victory." Evelina listened, her heart swelling with a mixture of sorrow and awe. He continued, each word a confession pulled from the depths of a pride he had protected for too long. "For years I underwent therapies the world mocked. They called it folly, a doomed pursuit for a man too stubborn to accept his fate. But I could not resign myself to the chair without making war upon its limitations. Standing, even briefly, is no triumph. They are moments stolen at great cost. Moments I wished no one to witness, lest they be seen as pitiful attempts at glory." His voice trembled as he looked at her at last. "I did not want you to see me like this." Evelina reached for his hand before doubt could paralyze her. He flinched at first, startled by the intimacy, but she did not release him. Her fingers closed around his with a gentleness he had long forgotten was possible. "What I saw," she said, "was courage. Not weakness. Not folly. Courage of the rarest kind, one that wages battle where no applause can reach." His breath caught. Rain softened against the glass, as though the storm, too, had paused to listen. "I feared you would recoil," he admitted. "Most do. Even those who mean well." "I do not recoil," she whispered. "I admire." A fragile silence settled between them, the kind that forms only when two souls recognize in each other a mirror of their own wounds. The Duke bowed his head, his hand tightening around hers as though grounding himself in her presence. The vulnerability he showed now was not forced by pain but chosen, an offering he had never extended to anyone. Evelina rose, retrieving the blanket draped over a nearby chair, and wrapped it gently around his shoulders. "You should rest," she said, the tenderness of her voice a balm. "You have pushed yourself beyond reason." He gave a faint, humbled nod. "I do so often," he confessed. "It is easier to pursue impossible goals than to confront the fear of disappointing those I hold dear." Her breath hitched. "Do you fear disappointing me?" "Yes," he answered, without hesitation. The soft weight of his honesty settled over her, warming her more deeply than the fire crackling in the grate. She placed a hand over his, offering quiet reassurance. "You have disappointed me in nothing," she said. "It is I who must prove worthy of the trust you have placed in me." They remained like that for a moment, two figures lit by the wavering glow of candle and firelight, the storm fading into a distant murmur. When the Duke finally straightened, some of the harshness had eased from his expression. "Evelina," he said, "your presence here tonight has altered more than you know." "And yours," she replied softly, "has begun to alter me." He met her gaze, the distance between them shrinking without either of them moving. Something unspoken passed between them, as potent as a vow yet delicate as a breath. Then, with a composure restored but forever changed, the Duke said, "There is much we must face, together." Evelina felt it then, unmistakably. The shifting of two lives beginning their slow convergence, like stars drawn into a shared orbit. Outside, the storm finally broke. But inside the dim chamber of the East Wing, something new had begun to gather. Quiet, fragile, and powerful enough to reshape the course of both their fates. The morning of their return to London arrived with a clarity that felt almost ceremonial, as though the very sky understood the significance of what was to unfold. Evelina stood beside the Duke's carriage, the crisp air brushing her cheeks as anticipation and unease mingled in her chest like two rival currents. Since the night she had discovered his secret struggle, something unspoken yet undeniable had bound them, altering the rhythm of every shared glance and every quiet exchange. He emerged from the doorway with Mr. Havering's steadying assistance, his expression grave but unafraid, as if he had made peace with whatever judgment awaited him beyond Ashberry's walls. When he reached the carriage, he paused beside Evelina, his gaze lingering on her face with a quiet trust that warmed her more deeply than the shawl around her shoulders. "We need not do this if you feel unready," he murmured, though the soft resolve in his voice betrayed his own willingness to face the world again. Evelina shook her head, steadying her breath, for she sensed not only his courage but her own rising from the remnants of humiliation that had once defined her. "I am ready," she said, offering her hand, and when he took it, the moment felt like a vow sealed without words. The journey to London was long but curiously peaceful, the Duke drifting between contemplation and cautious optimism while Evelina watched the passing landscape with growing resolve. She no longer feared society as she once had. Instead, she felt poised to confront it, fortified by the knowledge of the Duke's honesty and the fragile but unmistakable bond forming between them. Upon their arrival at a charity event hosted in Grosvenor Square, whispers swept through the gathered crowd the moment the Duke's carriage appeared, for his absence from society had become the subject of endless speculation. Evelina stepped down first, her posture composed, and when she turned to assist the Duke, she did so with deliberate grace that drew a collective breath from the onlookers. He accepted her support without embarrassment, his hand steady upon hers, and together they entered the hall, their united presence creating a ripple of silence more powerful than any rumor. Yet even as admiration flickered among a few sympathetic faces, others watched with thinly veiled disdain, their eyes sharp with the appetite for scandal. One such gaze belonged to Roland, who approached with a polished arrogance Evelina remembered too well, his lips twisting into a smile that sought to unsettle her. "Lady Evelina," he drawled, bowing with exaggerated civility, "I confess I did not expect to see you escorting your husband so attentively." His insinuation slithered through the air, earning scattered titters, but Evelina refused to surrender the calm dignity she had fought so fiercely to reclaim. "Better," she replied evenly, "to stand beside a man of honor than to cling to one whose pride collapses under the weight of truth." Roland's smile soured, but before he could retort, the Duke's voice joined theirs, calm yet resonant enough to hush the murmuring crowd. "My wife need not defend herself against those who mistake cruelty for strength," he said, his gaze fixed upon Roland with unwavering steadiness. Then, with the slightest shift of effort visible only to Evelina, the Duke placed his cane beside the chair and rose, slowly and deliberately, until he stood upright for several breathless seconds. Gasps erupted, fans fluttered. Even Roland's complexion blanched as the Duke straightened with a resolve born not of physical strength but of devotion that defied expectation. Evelina felt her heart swell with a pride so fierce it shamed her previous doubts, for in that brief, radiant moment, he stood not to impress society but to honor her. When his strength waned and he lowered himself back into the chair, Evelina stepped closer, resting her hand lightly atop his, a gesture of solidarity witnessed by all. The murmurs that rippled through the room carried not ridicule but astonished admiration, as if the crowd sensed they had seen something rare and unvarnished, a truth stripped of pretense. Roland retreated with a stiff bow, his defeat evident, and the noise of conversation gradually revived around them, though many eyes remained lifted in quiet awe. When the evening concluded, Evelina and the Duke returned to Ashberry Hall in contemplative silence, the carriage filled not with fatigue but with an unspoken understanding that something irrevocable had shifted. In the privacy of the drawing-room, lit only by the tender glow of the hearth, the Duke turned to her with a vulnerability that softened every line of his usually guarded expression. "Evelina," he said, the single word trembling with meaning, "you have given me reason to believe I may claim more of life than mere endurance." She stepped nearer, her breath catching as she realized that her own heart mirrored his confession with an intensity she could no longer deny. "And you," she replied, her voice shaking with sincerity, "have shown me that strength lies not in perfection but in the courage to rise despite the world's expectations." Their hands met, not with the tentative uncertainty of earlier days, but with the surety of two souls who had found in each other the solace they once feared unattainable. The room seemed to still around them, the fire crackling softly as though honoring the moment that bound them beyond duty, beyond circumstance, beyond the wounds of their past. When the Duke lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a reverent kiss upon her knuckles, Evelina felt her heart open fully, no longer restrained by caution or doubt. The storm that had once shaped their fears had passed, leaving in its wake not ruin but renewal, and the promise of a future no longer chained to shadows. Together, before the quiet firelight, they discovered that love, steady, deliberate, and deeply earned, could rise where despair once threatened to take root. And as the embers glowed warmly beside them, Evelina knew with solemn certainty that the life awaiting them would not be defined by limitation, but by the courage they had found in each other's unwavering presence. Long after the lamps were dimmed and the manor settled into tranquil slumber, they remained side by side, speaking in low, earnest tones about the dreams they had never dared to voice aloud, weaving hopes of a shared future marked not by society's judgments but by the quiet triumphs of companionship, compassion, and unyielding devotion that would guide them through every uncertain horizon yet to come. In that tender quiet, their new beginning settled gently into certainty at last.